I'm glad we lost." Those were the first words Ryan Brooks said to me 3 days after the championship game, and for a second I honestly believed I had misheard him. The stadium around us had been empty for hours, the towering floodlights casting pale circles across rows of silent blue seats that had once been packed with 40,000 screaming fans. The banners celebrating the finalists still fluttered above the upper deck, but now they looked less like symbols of pride and more like reminders of everything we had failed to become. I tightened my grip around the cold aluminum railing and stared at the perfectly cut field below, unable to bring myself to answer. 3 nights earlier, I had stood on that same grass believing my biggest dream was finally within reach. For years of early morning conditioning, endless road trips, bruised muscles, missed birthdays, and every sacrifice a college athlete could make had all led to 90 minutes that disappeared faster than I could understand. One mistake, one misplaced pass, one counterattack, one final whistle. That's all it took for a season filled with hope to become the worst memory of my life. Ever since then, my phone had become something I couldn't bear to look at. Sports pages replayed the mistake from every possible angle. Comment sections debated whether I deserved my scholarship. Former classmates suddenly became experts who claimed they had always known I wasn't good enough. Even strangers seemed convinced they understood exactly how it felt to carry an entire team's disappointment on your shoulders. I stopped opening messages after the first night because every notification made my chest feel tighter. Some teammates texted to check on me. Coach left 2 voicemails telling me not to disappear. My parents drove 3 hours just to leave homemade food outside my apartment because I wouldn't answer the door. But there was one person who stayed completely silent. Ryan Brooks, our captain, my roommate during away games. The guy who had spent 4 seasons pushing me harder than anyone else while somehow always believing in me more than I believed in myself. After the final whistle, I had looked for him. Through the chaos of cameras, reporters, and devastated teammates, but he was already gone. No call, no text, no explanation. That silence hurt far more than anything people wrote online. I convinced myself he blamed me. Maybe he should have. He had carried our team through countless impossible matches, scored goals that kept our championship dream alive, and trusted me with the ball when the season depended on it. I had repaid that trust by making the mistake everyone would remember. So when I heard footsteps climbing the concrete stairs behind me that night, Ryan was the last person I expected to see. He wasn't wearing our team jacket anymore. Just a gray hoodie, faded jeans, and an old pair of running shoes I recognized from freshman year. He looked exhausted, the kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. He walked beside me without saying another word, resting both hands on the railing as he stared across the empty field. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt heavier than that, as if both of us were standing beneath the weight of something neither one knew how to carry. Finally, Ryan reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out a small rusted key attached to a faded blue keychain shaped like a soccer ball. He placed it carefully into my hand before quietly saying, "Come with me. There's something I've wanted to show you since we were 14. I looked down at the weathered key resting in my palm before glancing back at Ryan, searching his face for some hint that this was another cruel joke my exhausted mind had invented. Instead, I found only quiet determination. Without waiting for an answer, he turned and started walking toward the parking lot beyond the stadium gates. For a heartbeat, I considered staying exactly where I was. Part of me believed I deserved to remain trapped in that empty stadium forever, replaying the same mistake over and over until the memory finally stopped hurting. But another part of me, the part that had trusted Ryan since we were awkward freshmen trying to earn a spot on the varsity roster, followed him without asking a single question. His pickup truck looked exactly the same as it had during college, slightly dusty with a cracked university parking decal still clinging to the windshield. The engine rumbled to life, and we pulled away from the stadium into streets that felt strangely unfamiliar despite being the roads we had driven hundreds of times after practice. Downtown was unusually quiet for a Friday night. Storefront lights reflected across rain-soaked sidewalks, and traffic signals changed colors for almost empty intersections. Ryan kept both hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, while soft classic rock played so quietly that I could barely recognize the melody. Usually he filled every drive with stories, terrible jokes, or debates about soccer tactics. Tonight the silence remained, but somehow it no longer felt hostile. It felt patient, as though he was waiting for the right moment instead of avoiding me. We left the city behind and followed a narrow county road lined with maple trees until familiar landmarks slowly returned. An old gas station where we used to buy sports drinks after weekend tournaments. A family-owned diner that gave our youth team free pie whenever we won. The church parking lot where parents organized carpools before away matches. Memories I had not visited in years rose one after another, each one carrying a version of myself that still believed every dream was possible. After nearly 20 minutes, Ryan turned onto a gravel road leading toward a neglected community sports complex. The chain-link fence surrounding the property leaned slightly inward, and weeds had begun reclaiming the edges of the cracked parking lot. The field itself was smaller than I remembered, its faded white lines barely visible beneath patches of uneven grass. The old scoreboard had frozen years ago, forever displaying a score that no longer mattered. I stepped out of the truck and breathed in the cool night air, realizing this was where everything had started. We had both been 14 when we attended open tryouts here for the county development team. I remembered arriving terrified that everyone else would be stronger, faster, and more talented than I was. Ryan had been the loud kid juggling a soccer ball while everyone stretched. My fingers trembled as I wiped years of dirt from the weathered metal lid. Rust had begun creeping along the edges, and the latch resisted before finally giving way with a soft click that echoed across the empty field. Inside were objects so ordinary that anyone else might have dismissed them as forgotten childhood keepsakes. A faded team photograph, 2 participation medals hanging together by tangled blue ribbons, a pair of worn captain's armbands folded neatly beside each other, ticket stubs from local tournaments, a cracked whistle. At the bottom rested a thick, white envelope with my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. Ryan's handwriting had always leaned slightly to the right, every letter careful, almost stubbornly perfect. I looked at him, confused. "You wrote this?" I asked quietly. He nodded once. 9 years ago. My heart skipped. "Why did you never give it to me?" Ryan smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "Because I promised myself I would only let you read it after we stopped chasing the same dream." I frowned, unable to understand. What does that even mean? He sat down on the damp grass without caring that his jeans would get dirty and looked toward the old goal where countless teenagers had once imagined becoming professional athletes. "Open it," he said. I carefully unfolded the yellowed pages, surprised to find several sheets instead of a single note. The first line immediately stole the air from my lungs. "If you are reading this, it means one of 2 things happened. Either we finally became champions together, or we learned that losing never really decides who we are." I blinked several times before continuing. Every sentence felt strangely alive, as though 14-year-old Ryan had somehow understood things that 23-year-old Ryan had never stopped believing. He wrote about our first practice together, laughing about how nervous I looked when coach asked everyone to introduce themselves. He admitted he had invented that ridiculous line about needing a friend because he noticed I was standing completely alone while everyone else already knew each other. He described our first passing drill, when we stayed almost an hour after practice because I refused to leave until I completed 50 perfect passes in a row. I remembered that evening instantly. I had forgotten almost everything else about being 14, but not the feeling of finally making that 50th pass, while Ryan celebrated louder than if we had won a championship. The letter continued through every season we played together. It mentioned bus rides where we argued over playlists, summer conditioning sessions in unbearable heat, frozen winter practices where we joked our feet had stopped working, and every ridiculous superstition I developed before important matches. I found myself smiling despite the heaviness inside my chest. Those memories had survived untouched beneath years of pressure, expectations, rankings, and trophies. Then my eyes reached a paragraph that made me stop breathing altogether. "There will probably come a day when you blame yourself for something that happens on a soccer field. If that day ever arrives, I hope somebody reminds you that the reason people trust you with the ball is because you are brave enough to keep asking for it. Most players hide when everything is on the line. You never do. Do not let one moment erase 1,000 acts of courage." I slowly lowered the pages and stared at Ryan. "How could you possibly have written this back then?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. He shrugged gently. Because you have always been the same person, Ethan. The game changed. The pressure changed. You never did. A cool breeze swept across the field, carrying the distant sound of crickets through the quiet night. I looked back at the letter, noticing one final folded page hidden behind the others. Unlike the rest, it had never been sealed. Ryan reached out and placed his hand lightly over it before I could unfold it. His expression grew more serious than I had ever seen. "Do not read that one yet," he said softly. "That page is the real reason I brought you here tonight. And if you read it before I tell you the truth, you will misunderstand everything that happened between us for the last 9 years." Ryan kept his hand resting gently on the folded page, almost as if he had been protecting it for years instead of minutes. I had never seen him hesitate before. On the field, he made decisions in an instant. As captain, he always knew exactly what to say after a tough loss or a hard-fought win. But now his confidence seemed to disappear into the quiet night surrounding us. He drew a slow breath and looked toward the empty bleachers where generations of young athletes had once imagined impossible futures. "Do you remember the last day of tryouts?" he asked. I nodded immediately. Coach announced the final roster. Ryan smiled faintly. "Do you remember what happened before that?" I searched my memory. Nervous players. Parents standing along the fence. The smell of fresh-cut grass. My hands shaking so badly that I could barely tie my cleats. Then it came back to me. "I almost left," I whispered. Ryan nodded again. "You packed your bag because you were convinced you were getting cut." I laughed quietly, embarrassed by the memory. I was not very confident back then. "No," he answered softly. "You were terrified." He reached into the metal box again and pulled out another object I had completely overlooked, a small folded roster sheet with coffee stains across one corner. My name appeared near the bottom of the selected players. Ryan's name sat near the top. Across the back, written in blue ink, was a sentence I had never seen before. "Do not let number 23 quit. He is going to change this team someday." Coach wrote that. I asked. "No," Ryan replied. "I did." I stared at him in disbelief. "You barely knew me." "That is true," he admitted. "But I watched you stay after every drill. I watched you practice when everyone else went home. I watched you apologize every time you made a mistake, even when nobody blamed you. I knew exactly what kind of player you were becoming." My throat tightened. For years I had believed I earned every opportunity entirely on my own. I never imagined someone else had quietly believed in me before I believed in myself. Ryan continued, his voice calm and steady. "Coach asked me which freshman deserved the last roster spot. He thought you were technically good enough, but he worried you would not survive the pressure. I told him he was wrong." I blinked hard. "You never told me any of this. You were not supposed to know." He smiled gently. "I wanted you to think you earned it because you did." The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of wet grass that instantly reminded me of countless evening practices. Ryan picked up one of the old captain's armbands from the box and turned it slowly between his fingers. "Do you know why I kept asking you to stay after training all those years?" I shrugged. "Extra practice." He shook his head. "That was the excuse." My heart skipped. "Then why?" Ryan looked down before answering. "Because every extra minute I spent with you became the best part of my day." Neither of us spoke after that. I could hear the distant hum of traffic somewhere beyond the trees, but the rest of the world seemed impossibly far away. My mind replayed every memory differently now. The shooting drills that always lasted longer than necessary. The long drives home after tournaments. The way Ryan always chose the seat beside mine on every bus. The late-night study sessions that somehow became conversations about everything except school. I had believed those moments happened because we were best friends. Now I was no longer certain. Ryan looked back at me with eyes carrying years of carefully hidden emotion. "There is something I have never been brave enough to tell you," he said quietly. "I almost told you after our sophomore season. Then again after we won the conference title last year. I even planned to tell you if we won the championship. But every time I convinced myself it would only make your life harder." My heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears as he slowly lifted his hand away from the final folded page inside the envelope. "Everything you need to understand begins with what is written there," he whispered. "Because that page was never meant for the future. It was written the night I realized my biggest dream had quietly stopped being soccer." My hands moved almost on their own as I unfolded the final page. The paper was softer than the others, its edges worn from being opened and closed countless times. before being hidden away again. Unlike the neat confidence of the earlier pages, this handwriting wandered across the sheet with crossed-out sentences and words squeezed into narrow spaces, as if Ryan had been arguing with himself while writing every line. The date in the corner caught my attention first. It was the night after our sophomore conference championship. I remembered that celebration perfectly. The team had filled a small pizza restaurant near campus, laughing louder than the music playing through the speakers. Ryan and I had stayed until everyone else left because neither of us wanted the night to end. I looked down and began reading. Tonight should have been the happiest night of my life. We won the biggest game we have ever played. Coach says professional scouts will probably come next season. Everyone keeps asking what my dream is now. I keep smiling because I do not know how to explain that my answer changed a long time ago. The words blurred for a second as I blinked away unexpected tears. I continued reading. I thought my biggest goal was lifting trophies beside my best friend. Then I realized I started looking for him before I looked at the scoreboard. Every celebration felt complete only if he was standing next to me. Every difficult practice became easier because he was there. I do not know when friendship quietly became something deeper, and honestly I am too afraid to find out. If I tell him, I could lose the most important person in my life. If I stay silent, I will spend years pretending my heart is somewhere else whenever he smiles at me. I stopped reading. My chest felt impossibly tight. Countless forgotten moments rushed back with startling clarity. Ryan waiting outside my apartment before 6 every morning because he knew I skipped breakfast unless someone reminded me. The extra pair of gloves he always carried during winter training because I constantly forgot mine. The nights he insisted on walking me home after late study sessions, claiming the neighborhood looked unsafe even though we had never once encountered trouble. Every thoughtful gesture I had accepted as ordinary friendship suddenly carried a meaning I had never considered. Why did you never tell me? I finally managed to ask. Ryan lowered his eyes and let out a slow breath. Because I knew what soccer meant to you. I knew how much pressure you already carried. I never wanted you to wonder whether every pass, every compliment, every conversation had another purpose behind it. He smiled sadly. You deserved one place in your life that never felt complicated. I looked back at the letter. So you carried this alone? He laughed quietly without humor. Not very well. He admitted that there had been dozens of moments when he almost confessed. Graduation. My birthday. The night I called him after learning my grandfather had passed away. Every time he convinced himself that risking our friendship would be selfish. Then he looked directly into my eyes with an honesty that left no room for misunderstanding. 3 nights ago, after the final whistle, I watched you blame yourself for losing a game that never belonged to one person. I wanted to run onto the field and tell you none of it mattered to me anymore. Not the trophy, not the championship, not even the scouts. The only thing I could think about was that you looked completely alone, and I hated myself for standing there doing nothing. His voice became quieter. So I walked away because if I had stayed another second, I would have told you everything in front of the entire stadium. I could barely breathe. For years I had believed Ryan disappeared because he blamed me. The truth was almost impossible to comprehend. He had left because he was trying to protect both of us from emotions he could no longer hide. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest, realizing the biggest misunderstanding of my life had survived for years simply because neither of us had ever found the courage to ask what the other was truly feeling. I remained silent for what felt like forever, turning the folded letter over in my hands while the night settled more deeply around the forgotten field. Every memory I had ever shared with Ryan seemed to shift into a different shape, like watching familiar stars rearrange themselves into an entirely new constellation. The strange thing was that nothing about those memories felt false. They only felt more complete. I remembered the afternoon I tore a ligament in my ankle during practice our freshman year. The trainers told me to stay off my feet for several weeks, and I had convinced myself my season was over before it had truly begun. Ryan showed up at my apartment the next morning carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches and a stack of class notes I had not even realized I had missed. Every day after practice, he stopped by to review game film with me, insisting I was still part of the team even if I could not step onto the field. At the time, I thought that was simply the kind of captain he wanted to become. Now I understood there had always been something more quietly guiding those choices. You remember all of that, do you not? Ryan asked with a small smile, almost reading my thoughts. I nodded slowly. I just never asked myself why you always seemed to be there before anyone else." He laughed softly. "Honestly, I hoped you would never ask." We both smiled for the first time that night, and the weight pressing against my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe comfortably again. "There is something I should tell you too," I admitted. Ryan looked at me without speaking, patiently waiting the way he always had whenever I needed extra time to organize my thoughts. "After the championship, I thought you left because you blamed me." His expression fell immediately. "Ethan, I never blamed you. Not for 1 second. I know that now." I looked down at the faded captain's armband resting beside the open box. But those 3 days were the loneliest I have ever felt. I kept replaying that final pass until I convinced myself I had ruined everything. Not just the season. Us. Ryan shook his head firmly. "You could never ruin us with one mistake." His words settled over me with surprising warmth. For years I had measured my worth by scoreboards, statistics, and performances. Somewhere along the way I had forgotten that the people who truly cared about me never used those things as conditions for staying. Ryan picked up one of the old participation medals and smiled at its scratched surface. "Do you know why I kept this instead of all the championship medals?" I examined it carefully before answering. "Because it was our first season?" "Exactly." He rolled the ribbon gently between his fingers. "Nobody expected anything from us back then. We played because we loved the game and because every practice meant another afternoon together. Somewhere along the way we started believing trophies were the reason all of this mattered." I looked across the empty field where faded goalposts stood quietly beneath the stars. It suddenly struck me that this forgotten place held more happiness than the enormous stadium where we had lost the championship. Here there had been no reporters, no rankings, no expectations. Just two nervous teenagers passing a soccer ball until sunset because neither wanted the day to end. "Maybe that is why I said I was glad we lost," Ryan continued. "Losing forced me to stop pretending I could keep living the same life forever." I turned toward him, hearing a steadiness in his voice that had not been there before. "What lie?" He met my eyes without hesitation. "That I could build an entire future around soccer while ignoring the person I wanted standing beside me after the final whistle, whether we won or lost." My heartbeat quickened again, but this time the feeling was different. The fear that had haunted me since the championship was slowly giving way to something gentler, something filled with possibility rather than regret. For the first time in days, I realized I was no longer thinking about the mistake that had cost us the title. I was thinking about everything that still remained unwritten between the two of us. Neither of us moved for several seconds. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest, as though years of unspoken thoughts had finally made enough room for the truth to exist between us without fear. I looked down at the letter one last time before carefully placing it back inside the envelope. "Can I ask you something?" I said quietly. Ryan nodded. "Anything." I drew a slow breath. "If we had won the championship, would you really have told me everything?" He smiled, but this time there was no uncertainty behind it. "That was the plan." He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out his phone before opening a note saved on the screen. I even wrote it down because I knew I would lose my nerve. He handed me the phone. My eyes scanned the words he had written days before the final. "Ethan, if we are celebrating tonight, I want you to know something before life carries us in different directions. Whether soccer takes us to different cities or different teams, you have already become the person I want beside me when every game is over. If you cannot feel the same way, I will still be grateful for every year we shared. But I do not want to spend another season pretending friendship is the only reason you matter to me." I slowly handed the phone back, overwhelmed by how carefully he had protected my feelings even in the middle of his own uncertainty. "You even planned for me to say no?" I whispered. Ryan shrugged gently. "Of course. You deserve that freedom." I looked at him for a long moment before asking the question that had quietly lived inside me for years without my realizing it. "Did you ever think I might feel something too?" He looked away toward the old goalpost before answering. "Sometimes." His voice became almost nostalgic. "There were little moments that made me wonder. The night you stayed at the hospital until my mom finished surgery because you did not want me sitting alone. The birthday when you drove 4 hours just to surprise me because I could not come home from preseason training. The way you always looked for me first after every match." He smiled softly. "But then I told myself best friends do those things too." I laughed quietly through the emotion gathering in my chest. I told myself exactly the same thing. Ryan turned toward me so quickly that his expression changed from calm to genuine surprise. What do you mean? I searched for the right words. I never questioned why you mattered so much because you had always been there. Every important memory somehow included you. Every accomplishment felt incomplete until you celebrated with me. Every bad day became manageable after one conversation with you. I thought that was simply what lifelong friendship felt like. My voice became quieter. But when you disappeared after the championship, it was not just that I missed my best friend. It felt like someone had removed the person who made every victory and every failure meaningful. Ryan stared at me without speaking. I could almost see years of doubt beginning to disappear from his eyes. Ethan, he whispered, but I gently shook my head. Let me finish. I smiled despite the tears threatening to escape. For 3 days I thought losing the championship was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Standing here tonight, I finally understand that the real pain was believing I had lost you. The breeze lifted the edges of the old letter beside us, as though the field itself had been waiting years to hear those words. Ryan slowly stepped closer, leaving only a few feet between us. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation, only quiet hope. So where does that leave us now? He asked softly. I looked around the forgotten field where 2 nervous 14-year-old boys had once dreamed about championships, professional careers, and impossible futures. Back then, neither of us could have imagined that the most important victory waiting for us would have nothing to do with the scoreboard at all. I met Ryan's eyes, feeling more certain than I had felt in a very long time, and realized that for the first time since the final whistle, my future no longer looked like something I had lost. It looked like someone standing right in front of me. Ryan took one careful step closer until only the quiet night separated us. Neither of us reached for the other. We had spent too many years respecting invisible boundaries to suddenly forget them now. Instead, he searched my face with the same patient expression he had worn on countless fields whenever he trusted me to make the next move. I never wanted to choose your future for you, he said softly. That is why I stayed silent for so long. I smiled, feeling a warmth I had not experienced since before the championship. You never did choose it, I answered. You only gave me the chance to finally understand it. For a moment we simply stood there, surrounded by the smell of fresh grass and the quiet rhythm of the wind moving through the old trees beyond the fence. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, the aging floodlights surrounding the community field flickered to life. The first light buzzed weakly before glowing bright white. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire field was bathed in soft golden light, chasing away the darkness that had hidden the faded lines and weathered goalposts. We both looked around in surprise before hearing laughter from the maintenance building across the parking lot. An elderly groundskeeper waved toward us from the doorway. Forgot to turn them off after checking the wiring. He called with an apologetic smile before disappearing back inside. Ryan laughed quietly, shaking his head. Even this place refuses to let us stay in the dark. I laughed with him, and it felt different from every forced smile I had worn over the previous 3 days. It was light, honest, free. Ryan looked back toward the illuminated field. Do you want to know something strange? He asked. When I imagined telling you the truth all those years, I always pictured us standing on a soccer field. Why? I asked. Because this is where I learned what commitment really looked like. Not from winning. From watching someone keep showing up every single day, even when nobody was watching. His eyes met mine again. That person was you. I felt my throat tighten once more, but this time there was no sadness attached to it. I always thought I admired you because you were our captain, I admitted. Now I think I admired you because you never made anyone feel like they had to earn your loyalty. Ryan smiled with the quiet certainty that had always steadied our team during difficult matches. You earned nothing, Ethan. You already had it. The words settled gently between us. I realized I had spent years chasing approval that had already been freely given. Championships, statistics, awards, scholarships, all of them suddenly seemed smaller than they had only a week before. Ryan slowly extended his hand, not as a dramatic gesture, but with the same familiar invitation he had offered me when we were 14. Years old before our very first practice together. Would you walk with me? He asked. I looked at his hand and smiled. You really have been asking me the same question for 9 years. He laughed softly. I guess I have. I slipped my hand into his. and the simple gesture felt remarkably natural, as though it belonged to every memory we had ever shared instead of beginning something entirely new. Neither of us rushed the moment. We simply stood there beneath the glowing lights, looking across the empty field where two frightened teenagers had once imagined success as something waiting at the end of a championship season. Now I understood that success could also mean finding the courage to tell the truth before another year quietly disappeared. Ryan gently squeezed my hand. Whatever comes next, professional teams, different cities, or completely different dreams, I do not want another season to pass without you knowing exactly how much you mean to me. I looked at him, no longer afraid of what the future might take away, because for the first time I knew exactly what I wanted to carry into it. Then let us stop waiting for the perfect ending, I said with a smile. Maybe this is where the real story finally begins. 1 year later, I stood at midfield wearing the same school colors, but I was no longer carrying the weight that had once convinced me a single mistake could define an entire life. The championship banner hanging above the stadium entrance looked beautiful in the afternoon sunlight, and thousands of fans filled the stands with the same excitement we had dreamed about since we were 14 years old. Yet as I waited for the opening ceremony to begin, I realized my eyes were not searching for the trophy waiting beside the stage. They were searching for Ryan. I found him a few yards away talking with one of our assistant coaches, smiling in that calm, familiar way that had carried both of us through victories, setbacks, long practices, and countless moments when neither of us believed we were strong enough to keep going. When he noticed me watching, he smiled even wider and gave me the smallest nod. It was the exact same gesture he had always given. Before kickoff, a quiet reminder that no matter what happened over the next 90 minutes, we would face it together. Our paths after graduation had not unfolded exactly as either of us expected. Ryan accepted an opportunity to continue playing while also beginning work toward becoming a youth coach. I chose graduate school and continued competing at the amateur level while volunteering at the same community field where we had first met. Every Saturday morning, we coached children who reminded us so much of ourselves that we often laughed about it afterward. There was always one nervous kid standing alone before practice, one loud teammate trying to make everyone smile, one player convinced a missed pass meant the world had ended. Whenever I saw that frightened expression, I remembered the letter Ryan had hidden for nearly a decade, and I found myself repeating the lesson he had once quietly taught me without ever expecting recognition. Courage was never about being perfect. Courage was asking for the ball again after making a mistake. That simple message changed more than my game. It changed my life. The old metal box remained buried beneath the goalpost at the community field, although we added something new before sealing it again. Alongside the faded photographs, medals, and letters, we placed a picture taken on the night we finally told each other the truth. It was nothing extraordinary. Two young men sitting on worn grass beneath aging floodlights, smiling with the peaceful relief that comes only after years of unnecessary silence finally end. We agreed that one day, many years from now, we would open the box again and remember that the most important victory either of us ever experienced happened on a forgotten field with no audience, no scoreboard, and no championship waiting at the end. The announcer called our names, pulling me back to the present. The crowd rose to its feet as our team walked toward the center of the stadium for one final recognition ceremony honoring the graduating seniors who had helped build the program. Cameras flashed. Music echoed through the stands. Somewhere behind us, the championship trophy reflected the afternoon sun, but I no longer measured success by polished metal. Ryan quietly moved beside me, close enough that only I could hear him. "Do you remember what I said the night we came back to the old field?" he asked with a smile. I nodded immediately. "You said you were glad we lost." He laughed softly. "I still mean it." I smiled back without hesitation because now I finally understood. If we had won that championship, we might have celebrated, accepted our medals, and continued pretending the most important conversation of our lives could wait for another day. Losing forced us to stop hiding behind dreams that had already begun to change. Sometimes life does not take something away to punish us. Sometimes it clears away everything that keeps us from seeing what has quietly been standing beside us all along. As the applause filled the stadium, Ryan reached over and briefly squeezed my hand before letting go again. A small gesture almost nobody noticed, but one that meant more to me than every cheer surrounding us. I looked across the field where another season would soon begin for players chasing championships of their own, and I silently hoped they would learn much earlier than we did that the greatest victories are rarely the ones engraved on trophies. They are the ones that teach you who never stopped believing in you, even when you had forgotten how to believe in yourself.